Hello everyone, I am Eugene Shkvar, a Ukrainian professor representing two institutions. The College of Engineering of the Chizan Normal University, located in China, and the Institute of Hydromechanics of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, situated in the capital of Ukraine, Kyiv. The title of my presentation is Comparative Analysis of Turbulent Flow Control using Leading-Edge Vortex Generators and Large Eddy Break-Up Devices. So, today we are going to talk about some devices which are able to change the vertical structure of turbulent flows due to its generation or destruction. Here you can see the presentation structure containing preface and motivations, objects of study, research methodology, results, purposeful implementations, and conclusions. So, let's start from the beginning. According to the principal goal of this conference, let me formulate my understanding of the relationship between vortex and vorticity as a preface to my presentation. The vorticity of a vector field V is a clearly predetermined mathematical flow property associated with a velocity curl. As a measure of the fluid element local rotation about their own axis, it is naturally a useful and well-applied mathematical tool for analyzing the rotational flow properties. The vortex is rather one of the flow types, or a physical flow property, so its mathematical description can have various forms, including vorticity, but in general sense, vortex is not equivalent to vorticity. And if we are interested in identifying the vertical structure of the flow, even without knowing the reliable definition of a vortex, we can use its limited approaches that are available to us and whose properties are known. This is partly similar to the fact that we numerically solve the system of Navier-Stokes equations on belief without having proof of the existence, uniqueness, and smoothness of its solutions. In other words, definitions such as the Vortex vector and the Q criterion are undoubtedly good and promising, but in a particular case, priorities may be determined by specific conditions and available opportunities. A particular problem that is important to me is the identification of vortex structures in experimental measurements, which limits the application of advanced technologies such as Vortex to both the 2D case, shown in particular by the pictures below, and the constant presence of noise. As a result, the construction of the vorticity field and the analysis of its inhomogeneity remains one of the most popular ways to characterize the vortex properties of the flow. Thus, I assume that the choice of theoretical means for identifying vortex structures is not unique and is determined both by the properties of the flow being studied and by the available tools with methodology used. And that is why such flow control devices that are associated with vortex generation and vortex destruction were chosen as the objects of this study. The practical importance of vortex identification and control is closely related to the drag reduction technology, where drag is the aerodynamic force directed oppositely to the vehicle motion and consisting of 5 independent components. It is important to note that 3 of them, namely induced, interference, and friction drag, have vertical nature. The induced drag can be effectively reduced by winglets. Pressure, interference, and wave drag components can be reduced by shape optimization that is currently close to optimal. That's why The friction drag is the important component for its reduction. In the cruise flight mode of a modern transport aircraft, the amount of friction drag is up to 47% of the total drag. So, the friction drag has a great potential for further minimization on the base of drag reduction techniques, and this is the key point of this study. Therefore, we are paying our attention not to optimizing the shape of the high-speed vehicle, but to improving the properties of its surface. One more very important aspect. According to the large sizes and high speeds of modern vehicles, up to 97% of their surface area is streamlined by the turbulent flow mode. But the turbulence also has a vertical nature. Therefore, any application of drag reduction technology first of all means the control of turbulence. Since turbulence is the complicated structure of interacting vortices with a wide range of scales from large inertial to small dissipative, it is important to clearly adjust turbulence control techniques to the scales they purposefully affect. The presentation goal is to show the results of velocimetry and visualization of a number of characteristics related to the large-scale vortex structure of turbulent flows modified by several passive turbulence control methods, like leading-edge tubercles, delta-shaped vortex generators, and large eddy break-up devices. Let's consider the objects of study in a more detailed form. It is a well-known fact that all the flow control methods can be separated into two large groups, namely passive methods, presented here by sections 1 and 2, which don't require any energy for their realization, and active methods, presented here by the sections 3 and 4, that can be used only if some additional energy is used. From a wide variety of passive methods, including in particular micro and macro riffling of the streamlined surface, we will consider the modificators or tubercles of the leading edge of the lifting surface, which are able to generate vortices in the neighborhood of this surface, as well as very small and thin plates like blades installed near the streamlined surface and directed to breaking up of the large eddies generated by the turbulence. Here you can see several natural implementations of near-wall vortex structures, namely the regular micro-relief, so-called riblets of the shark skin that creates the near-wall longitudinal vorticity aimed at reducing the turbulent friction drag, and the pectoral fins of the humpback whale with a tubercled leading edge are another good example of the purposeful creation of regular near-wall vortex systems, which significantly improve maneuverability when swimming by expanding the range of angles of attack of the fins with no flow separation. And this slide illustrates several workable engineering implementations of the leading edge tubercles, namely the blades of the wind turbine with modified leading edge, and the blade wheel of the industrial fan. A common property of all mentioned above natural and engineering objects is their ability to create the irregular vertical systems with neighboring vortices, having the opposite direction of rotation, so-called the counter-rotating vortex pairs, or briefly CRVP. The most important difference between the various CRVPs is the wide range of possible scales, from micro for riblets to macro for vertical systems behind the wing surface, dimples, or leading edge tubercles. These vortex pairs form a self-sustaining near-wall vertical structure that makes boundary layer more spatial and stable to its separation. Just a few words about the research methodology. In my research, I develop and combine both CFD simulation techniques based on the Reynolds average Navier-Stokes equations with semi-empirical turbulence modeling and the large eddy simulation, as well as experimental measurements based on the time-resolved particle image velocimetry. This presentation will be more focused on the experimental results. Here you can see the certified closed-loop wind tunnel used in our experiments. Its maximum speed is 60 meters per second, and the turbulence intensity level doesn't exceed 0.5%. And this slide illustrates our time-resolved particle image velocimetry measuring system that allows to conduct the PIV measurements with physical frequency up to 3.2 kHz. The time-resolved particle image velocimetry is well adjusted to flow visualization, as well as to quantitative analysis of flow properties with good level of resolution in both time and space. This slide illustrates the process of synthetic jet generation and further evolution of disturbances injected with frequency of 100 Hz to the turbulent boundary layer developing over the dimpled surface. So, let's consider and discuss the results obtained. The first engineering object of our consideration is a wing with leading edge tubercles, inspired by the leading edge of the humpback whale fins at the natural bionic basis of the studied technology. And the main physical mechanism of streamline vortex generation is the flow non-uniformity in the leading edge region. We developed and tested 5 different wing models with a chord of 100 mm, a span of 200 mm, and a length of a tubercle from 5 to 35% relative to the chord. Our wind tunnel testing setup allowed us to freely change the angle of attack and conduct the two-dimensional, two-componental measurements in the wake region of flow with the use of one CCD camera. A few words about tubercle shape. We tested the ellipsoidal shape of tubercles with the maximum thickness of 10 mm, with the gap between any pair of neighboring thickness of 20 mm, and in addition we tested both straight and slightly bent tubercles in the direction opposite to the angle of attack. The conceptual idea of the bent tubercles is to overcome the most significant disadvantage of this technology associated with the additional drag induced by vortex structure generated by tubercles even in cruising aircraft configuration. The bent tubercle flows more symmetrically, and at a cruising angle of attack, it creates minimal resistance, practically without affecting the boundary layer. In all our tests, we used the symmetrical airfoil NACA 0012. Our two-dimensional and two-componental PIV measurements were made in two planes, normal to the span of our wing model. Namely, plane 1 is the plane of symmetry of the tubercle. Its allocation is presented by this picture. And plane 2, that is the plane of symmetry between any pair of neighboring tubercles, and its allocation is shown by this picture. A wide set of the results of measurements was obtained by us in the interval of incoming flow speed from 5 to 40 meters per second. That corresponds to the interval from laminar to fully developed turbulent flow mode. Here you can see the results of measurements of averaged velocity profile, as well as the profiles of kinetic energy of turbulence along the direction of flow development, made in the plane 1 and plane 2 respectively for the pre-separating angle of attack 14.1 degree. These results allowed us to make the following conclusion. As the length of the tubercles increases, the thickness of the wake flow region and the turbulent kinetic energy decreases for the laminar flow mode due to boundary layer separation prevention, and these both properties slightly increase for the turbulent flow mode compared to the reference case shown by red lines and corresponding to the wing with no tubercles. And this slide illustrates the results of measurements in the plane parallel to the wingspan and located 10 millimeters above the wing model with tubercles. And you can see that even in the instantaneous case, this flow field is close to uniform, excepting the small region in the neighborhood of the tubercles, where you can see the set of periodic disturbances. This fact means that the vertical structure generated by the leading edge tubercles is rather weak. Nevertheless, the PIV technology of measurements is able to recognize it. This slide illustrates the non-stationary periodic dynamics of a tuberclate wing, together with the results of velocimetry in the wake region and the corresponding numerical simulations. The frequency of these oscillations is of 2.25 Hz. And you can see that even in this case, the velocimetry of the wake region is quite informative from the point of view of the change of location and change of thickness of the wake zone. In addition to the previous measurements, it is very important and interesting to be able to get the section of the streamwise generated vortices with the plane normal to their axis. I mean the transversal plane 3. And the next part of this study is dedicated to this problem solving. The testing setup for this two-dimensional three-componental case is presented by this slide, and you can see that in this case we need to use not one but two CCD cameras. And for making the accurate measurements, these two cameras should be placed strictly symmetrical to the plane of the laser beam. In this part of this study, we tested three models. The model 1 contained large paired delta-shaped vortex generators with the length of 30 millimeters and height of 10 millimeters. The model 2 contained the array of smaller paired vortex generators with lengths of 10 millimeters and height of 4.5 millimeters installed in the neighborhood of the leading edge. The distance is 10 millimeters. And the last model is the wing model with tuberclid leading edge. All these models were tested for the incoming flow speed of 10 meters per second and at the angle of attack of 14.1 degrees. The measurements were made in the transversal plane located in the near wake 5 millimeters from the trailing edge. In the case of the model 1 with large vortex generators, we were able to get the qualitative secondary flow containing the symmetric distribution of vorticity with opposite signs. The modulus of the maximum velocity of the secondary flow is about 2 meters per second, and it means that this vertical structure of streamline paired vortices is strong, and it is not a problem to reproduce this kind of strong vertical flow. In the case of the array of smaller paired vortex generators with delta shape, we are also able to get the periodic vertical structure of secondary flow in the near wake, but the modulus of the secondary velocity is about 0.9 meters per second. This slide demonstrates the measurements of secondary flow in the transversal plane for the tuberclid leading edge wing model. This is the most complicated case because the vortices are the weakest. And if we make the measurements in the neighborhood of the leading edge with tubercles, the distance between plane of measurements and leading edge is just 15 millimeters, we are able to get the periodic structure of the secondary flow. But if we make the measurements in the near wake 5 millimeters from the trailing edge, we are able to get something similar to periodic, but in this case the secondary flow velocity is about just a half of meters per second, and this value is compatible with the error of measurements. That's why in this case the measurements aren't very reliable. Nevertheless, very accurate measurements and further post-processing allowed us to get the physically correct result even in this complicated region. And here you can see the testing setup for the second part of our study associated with the large eddy breakup devices. In this case, you can see the system of 5 devices like this. Each of them had the length 10 millimeters, thickness 0.2 millimeters, and the distance between any pair of neighboring devices is 2.5 millimeters. We tested the different number of the installed large eddy breakup devices from 1 to 5, and the measurements were made in the boundary layer behind the large eddy breakup devices. This slide illustrates the reference case of boundary layer for the incoming flow speed 30 meters per second without large eddy breakup devices. And you can see our ability to make the correct and accurate measurements of velocity distribution that is presented in semi-logarithmic coordinates in comparison with classical velocity distribution in the inner region of the turbulent boundary layer. And this slide illustrates the distributions of instantaneous and averaged velocity profiles, together with the distributions of vorticity presented by different colors, in the flows for incoming flow speed from 5 to 52.7 meters per second. And these results demonstrate well the non-monotonic velocity distribution in the wake behind the system of Labo devices, as well as non-monotonic distribution of vorticity. And this slide illustrates the results of comparison of velocity profile distributions and the distributions of kinetic energy of turbulence in different sections along the flow development for clear boundary layer without flow control, dashed blue lines, and in the case of presence of 1 and 5 large eddy breakup devices. And we can see that even in case of presence of only one large eddy breakup devices, it allows us to strongly modify the velocity distribution and increase the velocity defect, as well as it is able to reduce the level of kinetic energy of turbulence in the surface vicinity. As a result, it is natural that the friction drag will decrease. As a result, the following conclusions can be formulated. First, based on the analysis carried out, the priority and potential of the methodology for improving the vertical structure of flow near the streamlined surface is justified. Second, in the case of 2D PIV measurements, the analysis based on the velocity and vorticity flow fields can be quite informative. And the third, the corresponding experimental programs that have been developed make it possible to purposefully adapt the considered technologies to the expected operating conditions for high-speed vehicles, which provides a methodological basis for minimizing aerodynamic drag, reducing fuel consumption, and accordingly reducing harmful carbon emissions into the Earth's atmosphere. And this slide shows the list of some last-time publications of the author and his colleagues associated with the subject of this study. As an afterword, dear colleagues, let me tell you that if you have any interest in the flow optimization and control methodology development and its further application, I'll be happy to cooperate with you. My email is presented here. Thank you very much for your kind attention.